I was with UNICEF for 21 years, and most of that time spent or was focused on public health and vaccines. And as a part of that, I spent a lot of years negotiating contracts with the pharmaceutical industry, but also was very involved in humanitarian response. I was a Gavi board member for 8 years, also had some experience with the Global Fund Board. I left UNICEF in 2019 and therefore wasn't there during the pandemic, but I was brought back to help support and advise UNICEF on their efforts in helping populations have equitable access to medical countermeasures. And since then have continued to support in many ways the multilateral system on applying lessons learned and being better prepared for the future. In particular, I support and work with WHO, but I'm an independent contractor, so I'm not speaking for WHO. I really welcome the opportunity to provide some reflections. The current Article 15 language, and of course the whole construct of the INB negotiations, is really about state actors and the responsibilities of state. But there are some populations who either cannot or aren't served by state actors. And these very populations have additional or specific or more vulnerabilities, and include people groups like asylum seekers, refugees, foreign-born migrant workers, stateless persons, internally displaced persons, and even minorities. And the issue of liability, since it's grounded so much in the provision of, or the ability of national governments to indemnify manufacturers, again, when a national government isn't able or willing to do so for these people groups, then these people groups are really left behind. And we could see it firsthand with COVID. We also saw it with monkeypox. And of course, we saw with COVID, there were instruments that were developed to try to mitigate those issues. And obviously the COVAX humanitarian buffer was one of those. And this was a set of doses that were accumulated as a part of the COVAX contracts that would be made available to in situations where governments didn't control an area of their territory, or where national authorities tried to but couldn't reach or couldn't support vaccinations to populations of concern, and just in other cases where national governments otherwise couldn't or wouldn't support certain groups. But the complexity became that who was going to still provide the indemnification? So there were doses that were made available, but they couldn't be shipped or provided to countries because of this issue of who would be assuming liability. And there were obviously very experienced and capable humanitarian actors that were ready to facilitate delivery and uptake of the vaccines, including MSF and many others. And these actors or NGOs were asked to indemnify manufacturers, and which was a financial liability that they could not afford, which meant that the doses couldn't be provided. And this same sort of block occurred when countries had extra doses and wanted to donate those to people in humanitarian crisis in another territory, another state. And they at times were also unable to do so, including because they obviously couldn't provide indemnity for people in other populations in other countries. And there wasn't an intermediary or way of providing those indemnifications. So we have many examples of when that occurred, including, a country in South Asia that wanted to move doses cross-border, but was unable to because of this very issue. Similar issues were faced with monkeypox. So more recently with monkeypox, WHO was asked to receive donations and then indemnify manufacturers and take on the liability for products that had only received approval for emergency use. So again, it's not just COVID, but also all of these novel products when there is either a large outbreak or a pandemic, obviously, but an urgent need for uh, a product that hasn't reached its final approval stage, but is at an intermediary stage of approval. WHO has been able to take out insurance for the use of novel products for investigational purposes. So when they're doing, for example, a trial, but the insurance is able to be secured because it's for such a limited number of doses and a narrow scope of use and well-defined scope of use, but they haven't been able to find the solution for broader use of novel products that aren't fully approved. And of course, you know, the heart of the matter is who should assume the risks of liability. The no-fault compensation and insurance provide mechanisms to pay out. But still, even if those exist, and the no-fault compensation that was developed for COVID vaccines was such an important tool, and so novel and innovative, and it was so impressive that that was established, but it really is only a partial solution. And if we're not able to address the indemnification issue, then the doses still can't reach populations in need. So if things aren't complicated enough, this is another issue that if we're true to not wanting to leave anyone behind, it's best that we also in advance try to find solutions for these populations that really in many ways are even more vulnerable or also as vulnerable as some of the high-risk populations that are in most need of these novel medical countermeasures. I think the current Article 15 is silent on this issue, and don't know if it's possible for it to be mentioned and therefore to also be included in some of the preparatory work that would then provide solutions in advance or have pre-positioned mechanisms or instruments that could be available. So I think, Shanelle, as you described, it's not trying to be negotiated in the heat of the moment when there are such imbalances of power and also so many other things to tackle with that represent much larger numbers of people, and these groups of people that are so vulnerable can more easily even be left behind. So again, thanks for the opportunity to bring this people group to the discussions, and hopefully it helps some reflections on moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's I think it's worth noting sort of in places where we see large stateless movements, refugees, militarized crises, there's a lot of overlap with places where we anticipate infectious disease threats may emerge. So I have in mind the Darien Gap. I have in mind sort of South Asia. So it isn't just, although it's enough for humanitarian instinct to drive us. I think there's also a pragmatic reason we should be thinking and prioritizing in that way. Our next speaker is currently a senior scholar at the O'Neill Institute. He's also a professor from practice at the University of New Hampshire Law School, but led in really critical ways the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations participation in the global response over the course of COVID-19. And for that, I want to sort of repeat a thanks I've issued many times, but has a really valuable perspective on some historical cases and ways of thinking about the issue, again, as it takes form in a proposed pandemic accord. So Dick, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks a lot, Sam. Thanks for the kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Sorry, I turned the camera off. And yes, I was general counsel at CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, during the COVID-19 pandemic, and was intimately involved in the work in establishing the no-fault compensation mechanism in tandem with the indemnification provisions. And one other person on this call, Anthony Brown, was at that time at Gavi, and was one of, I would say, the three people that were sort of on a daily basis engaged in this work at a fairly high level. That was myself and Tony, and then also Anne Mazur from the World Health Organization. And UNICEF was also, very much involved at that time as well, trying to figure out, how in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we'd be able to address the needs both of the industry that was indicating a requirement for some degree of protection from potential liability, but as well the governments, that were leading the work domestically to vaccinate people and to address, in the many dimensions of the pandemic, and then also the patient population, very importantly, that ensure that they get access to the latest and greatest as quickly as possible of vaccines and other interventions. And I think that, John and Sharmila and Shanelle have provided a lot of information about this field generally, and a bit of history about it. And so I'm going to go through my notes that I made in anticipation of this talk and filter out those things that I think have been adequately covered, and then just focus on what I think would be of interest for this group to get a better understanding historically of how things have evolved, including in the context of a pandemic with COVID-19, to address these issues around potential liability and risk. So I think there's two realities about vaccines that really drive this debate and discussion. One is the fact that vaccines, unlike a host of other interventions, are administered to otherwise healthy people for the most part. Certainly there are vaccines now that are being introduced that are more therapeutic than they are prophylactic. But I think when we think about vaccines, it's more for the protective effect and administered to otherwise healthy people. And there's also an inevitable risk of the possibility, there's an inevitable risk of serious adverse events, such as intussusception of an infant following vaccination, an anaphylactic reaction, things that are likely to happen and are not a consequence of the design or manufacture of the vaccine. And so the question then is, how do you address that reality? Well, for the companies, as has been indicated, they want to be able to sell into markets where they have a very good handle on the potential risks, commercial risks in terms of, potential sales and profits and all that kind of good stuff, but then also potential risks associated with people being injured by the vaccines. And basically there are, and this Sam, I was reading one of the articles that you published on this, actually before the COVID-19 outbreak, but there are three approaches that could be taken to address potential risks. One is to just leave it entirely in the hands of the patient, to say, if you get a vaccine, then it's up to you to deal with, what might happen in the event of serious adverse events. The other would be, if a patient is, or a recipient of a vaccine is injured, they could take legal action against the manufacturer, sue them for product liability, for example, to get compensation. And then the last would be what we're talking about here, would be the publicly supported systems for compensation, especially the no-fault compensation mechanisms, or some combination of the three. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Sort of historically, these kinds of systems for no-fault compensation and ways in which the structure can be done such that it meets the needs of industry, the patients, the governments involved. The first one that I'm aware of was in 1961 in Germany, as a consequence of a Supreme Court ruling there that required compensation for people that are injured through a compulsory smallpox vaccination. And this gave rise to concern of industry because they were manufacturing this vaccine. And again, even if it, it was inevitable that there was going to be some injuries that arise as a consequence of taking the vaccine, even if it's properly designed and manufactured. And so, there was the concern of the companies that they were going to be subject to multiple lawsuits. There were concerns of the country, Germany, and other countries after as well, that as a consequence of these kind of undefined scope of potential liability, that the companies may decide they just don't want to play in those markets or participate in developing vaccines or bringing vaccines to market in certain countries where they don't feel they've got a good handle on potential liability. This was, followed up with actions taken in the U.S. in the 1970s, the 1980s. There were, some cases, such as in Germany, that arose where there were injuries that were raised, and the same kind of concerns came up of companies maybe not being willing to manufacture and distribute vaccines, and also the potential of lawsuits, being filed, the difficulties that both, the parents of kids that wanted to get certain vaccines, or the governments that wanted to put in place vaccination campaigns, wouldn't be able to do so because of a lack of vaccines as a consequence of this liability situation. So in the US, laws, actually a series of laws, were put into place for childhood vaccines, vaccines generally, and then also in the event of pandemics. And at its core, in the US anyway, it provided for a limited liability, which I think others on this workshop, or in this workshop, have discussed about. Limited immunity in the sense that, by law, you would not be able to bring legal action against a company because of side effects or serious adverse effects of a vaccine, that unless the side effects were unavoidable, and if the side effects were unavoidable and the vaccine was properly prepared and labeled. So in other words, the limited immunity would not apply in the event that a vaccine was improperly prepared, improperly labeled, improperly produced, and so on. So it was the fault of the company that gave rise to the injury. The surveys that I've seen, kind of looking at it from, starting, as I indicated, from perhaps a developed country perspective with Germany, the US, and then other countries following, there's now somewhere around 25 countries that have no-fault compensation systems in the event of a vaccine, causing an injury. Perhaps I should say, just parenthetically, is that when we talk about no-fault compensation mechanisms, it means that the individual that's injured doesn't have the burden of showing that the vaccine was produced through negligence, or that there was a direct cause, prove the causation as between the administration of the vaccine and the injury. But rather there has to be some either contemporaneous administration of the vaccine and then the injury, or some basic proof of a nexus between the fact that you received a vaccine and that you then suffered an injury. The COVAX mechanism, this is one of the examples, I suppose, of, and there were others actually before this as well. When you think about the Ebola outbreaks in West Africa in 2014, 2016, which I can say just parenthetically was the primary impetus for the development of CEPI, where I used to work, an organization to fund the development of vaccines against infectious diseases, especially those on the World Health Organization's blueprint list. But we had, in the context of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were efforts not only to develop vaccines, and we were involved in those, but then also look at, once the vaccines were developed, how then they were going to be manufactured and distributed on a global basis. And lots of discussions about geographic scope of manufacturing capability and capacity, intellectual property and IP licensing. But then also this issue of potential liability came up early and often, and with a fair degree of urgency. And in addition to the usual issues that companies would raise about not wanting to be subject to a myriad of lawsuits, not wanting to have a great deal of uncertainty about the potential commercial risk if they were to go into a market. In addition, these vaccines, as you know, were approved, at least initially, to be available to markets on an emergency basis. And so it wasn't a full regulatory approval, but rather it was one that was done based upon the information that was developed, sufficient to show that the vaccines were safe and effective, but not having gone through the entire process for full regulatory approval. And then, there was, in addition, the speed at which the vaccines were being developed, which was unprecedented. To bring a vaccine to market within a year. And nowadays the target is 100 days from the identification of a new pathogen to having a vaccine. So speed has always been the essence, will continue to be a focus of work. So the speed, but then also in some instances, like with the mRNA vaccines developed, by BioNTech and by other companies, that it was a new technology, new platform that was the basis then for those vaccines. So it introduced additional elements of uncertainty, and the companies raised those concerns. Now, on the sort of countervailing side, in terms of what could or should be done, there were others obviously that were very active in this debate. So not just the companies, but those including in the international sector, including those that were part of the COVAX mechanism. That is with CEPI and the WHO and UNICEF and Gavi. They had a particular focus on wanting to bring these vaccines to market for the benefit of the countries that are going to be receiving and administering them, and more importantly, for the benefit of the people that were receiving them. And there was a desire not only to see to it that those vaccines were developed and manufactured and distributed, but that they were equitably accessible on a global basis, and that the access wouldn't be done to the disadvantage of the people that are receiving the vaccines. That is excluding potential liability, let's say, entirely, but then not providing some degree of protection for the people that are receiving these vaccines, again, that had been made available on an emergency basis, have been developed rapidly and on new platforms. So there was a desire to address the concerns of the companies. There was a desire to address the concerns of the countries and the people involved as well. And so, there was set up in parallel to this mechanism that will provide a degree of protection for the companies, to one that also included a compensation mechanism that would compensate people in the event that that they are injured as a consequence of taking a vaccine. I'd be happy to. I know that I have just a little bit of time left here, about 5 minutes actually. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in terms of how the compensation mechanism worked, in the sense of how much of a compensation, how often compensations were paid, and that type of thing. But I can during the Q&As if people want to focus on that. What I wanted to say about the mechanism that was set up is twofold. One is that the scope of coverage endpoint, or scope of coverage, the scope of coverage endpoint for the COVAX mechanism was 24 months following the date on which a vaccine was first put into circulation. Now, this is an important component, if not innovation, of this mechanism. The purpose of which was to address the point, that it may be possible for the companies to insure against the potential for injuries as a consequence of the administration of a vaccine, and addressing that potential risk could be done through self-insurance or getting insurance from the commercial sector. Now, again, going back to where we were at the beginning of the outbreak, there was a lot of uncertainty about, the whether, vaccines would be developed within a timely fashion, and then uncertainty as a consequence of, these new platforms that were being used, the speed of development, the fact that the vaccine was available under emergency authorization. And so, while there was a need, to address as many of those uncertainties as possible, in this kind of compensation mechanism, the feeling was, that by a certain period of time, some of the uncertainties would be resolved, such that the companies would be in a position to seek and obtain their own insurance, either self-insurance or insurance, from companies. And with respect to, again, going back to the notion of the no-fault compensation in the COVAX mechanism, the inquiry, was whether the vaccine was the most probable cause of the injury. Most likely caused based on the balance of probabilities that a vaccine or its administration resulted in a claimed injury. So again, there wasn't a need to prove a technical correspondence between the vaccine or the way that it was administered and the injury. It was just sufficient, that there was a balance of the probabilities that was shown that indeed that's what gave rise to the injury. There was also a need, to have a publicity campaign for the COVAX no-fault compensation mechanism, so that countries, people that were administering the vaccines, hospitals and so on, would be aware of it in the event that injuries occur, and what they would have to do in order for a particular patient to seek compensation. The other piece, I'm going to talk about this and then one other point, and then close, my presentation here. But another piece of the mechanism that was set up in COVAX, and this is something that has been discussed by some of the other folks on this panel, is indemnification. And in the case of COVAX, the indemnification was for the countries that within which the vaccines are going to be administering, the countries within which the vaccines are going to be administered would agree that in the event that there was a legal action that was taken against a company for liability, again, this would not be a no-fault context, but rather it would be an action taken in court by someone who is injured, to say that because of negligence or some other cause, the vaccine was unsafe, caused the adverse event, and the compensation should be paid. And so what the companies required was that they would be indemnified against the possibility of those kinds of action being taken and successful. And what that would mean is that the country would agree to pay, whatever the judgment was by the court for that liability. Now, the theory, and it's actually a theory that works in practice for COVAX, it's worked in practice in other contexts, was that you would have the possibility of legal action being taken. You would require indemnification with the expectation that the no-fault compensation mechanism would be sufficiently attractive that would be the route that most people that are injured would take, rather than taking legal action against the company in the national courts, because that takes time, takes money, it's uncertain, and so forth. But with the no-fault compensation mechanism, it's more sure, it's more certain, it can be processed quite quickly to provide compensation. So I'm laying out, these elements here with the indemnification, the no-fault compensation mechanism, the scope of coverage issue that I mentioned, 24 months, then the companies would have to seek, their own insurance mechanism. I'm laying these out just to say that, there are a number of elements that necessarily one has to go through in thinking in a particular context as to what the best way forward is. And, there's a number of examples across the world as to how these things can be structured, including no-fault compensation mechanisms where it's a government that's paying for it, or no-fault compensation mechanisms like in Sweden, for example, where it's an insurance mechanism, the premiums of which are paid by the companies. There's a number of different options that could be looked at, but there's 6 or 7 different elements that have to be addressed in setting up such a system. Administration and funding, again, whether the funding is going to be, by industry, by the insurance sector, by by the companies that are manufacturing or otherwise. Eligibility for compensation. How is it that, you are making a determination that a particular injury is as a consequence of the administration of the vaccine? Process for decision making, these mechanisms, they have to be administered. You have a standard of proof as to whether or not, somebody has or has not been injured. A variety of elements of compensation, that could be for, it could be, the injury itself. It could be loss of time at work, for example, or it could be, things that are a temporary injury or permanent injury. So there's a number of different elements of compensation that have to be looked at. And then this issue of litigation, whether litigation will be possible, and if so, under what circumstances, and will it be limited, and so forth. Now I'm just kind of laying that out, just to indicate sort of not so much the complexity of this issue, but rather that there's a number of different considerations that have to be fully addressed in setting up a mechanism to address potential liability, including a responsive and no-fault compensation mechanism. And the other is to say that these elements will vary depending upon whether this is a national undertaking or something that is intended to be on a global basis, like the COVAX mechanism.